You're listening to Agile Ideas, the podcast, hosted by Fatima Abuchi. You're listening to Episode 4, Transforming to an Agile Environment, Learnings and Insights from the Trenches. Hi everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in once again. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about the transformation towards an agile environment and what that means for the PMO. The reason being is I've been having a number of conversations over the last few weeks as part of the research for our upcoming white paper. And the conversations have been focused around talking to leaders, in the information space and technology space, so CIOs, CTOs, predominantly has been the current focus, as it seems that they are kind of leading the way in moving their delivery environments to more agile ways of working, or at least in the conversations and the organisations that I've been speaking to. The IT departments are sort of leading the way and working with the business to bring them along on that journey. In the conversations I've been having over the last few weeks, but also even earlier than that, it's actually something that has been repetitive over the last, I'd say pretty much the last couple of years. It's becoming more prominent now. But the conversations are around CIOs and CTOs looking to revise their PMOs. Whether or not you believe in PMO in an agile world, and we'll get to that. Having an existing PMO function, having an existing governance function, support function, whatever you want to call it, I think that many organizations, if not all of them, especially the larger ones, have some form of PMO. You may not call it that. You might call it a portfolio office. You might call it a PMO. You might call it an ePMO. You might call it the governance and support team. Whatever you want to call it, the objective of that office is very similar, I would say, across many of those organizations. So for the purpose of this podcast, let's just refer to it as PMO. So CIOs and CTOs that I've been speaking with are seeking a revision to their PMOs, and they want to transform their existing PMOs into a more agile environment. Some of these organizations have gone as far as removing completely their PMO function, and other parts of other organizations have decided to keep their PMO, but are looking to revise their focus and their offering and what they do within the organization. Now, I'm going to say that regardless of what you call it, the sort of the key aspects of what a PMO does, which, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, is around financial management, centralization of standards and approaches and whatnot. There are things that happen and that are done, if done well, by PMOs that are still completely relevant in an agile environment. Now, we have to remember that there are going to be people that are talking about agile in the sense of the manifesto and actually the aspects of the agile space that is really, really specific, where they will argue with me that there is no need for PMOs, governance or support because teams are self-governing and whatnot. And that's okay. That's an opinion that they're welcome to have. And I think that although that may be true in some organizations, in particular, what Agile was originally created for, software development organizations, but the rise of Agile in organizations of every sort of shape and size and every industry is proving to me and probably to many of you that there actually is a need for some sort of support, governance, PMO type activity. And I'll go through a few examples shortly in regards to why I think that having that is still necessary. But either way, we're talking to leaders at the top of their game in chief information space and technology space, and they're saying that they are looking for a revision of their existing functions and to transform them to a more agile environment. So it's clear that there is plenty of understanding around transformation. There's plenty of understanding around agile methodology. However, there's not as much of that within the space of PMO and the governance and support functions. So in the last sort of 3 to 4 years, I've personally been involved in a number of various types of agile environments, including SAFe, Scrum, traditional agile that is very close to what the manifesto says about it, but also to methods like SAFe that have been created that are focused on agile ways of working. And excuse me, and doing so in the last 3 to 4 years, I've personally, through working with those teams and working with the experts in the agile space and working with other departments and divisions within the organization, have been able to drive better agility through integration of their existing PMO governance support, or whatever you want to call it, functions, and their delivery bodies. And when I talk about delivery bodies, we're talking about portfolios, programs, and projects. Whether it's IT or business is irrelevant. So I wanted to give you some examples. I will just talk about the industry and some of what I've seen, and then I will give you some examples of learnings that you could take away with you. So looking at it in different organizations, one example, working within the banking space. So what did the banking organization do around their agile, transforming their PMOs, etc., to an agile environment? Well, in terms of the banking organisation, what I've seen there is there is actually, I've worked with a couple of banks, a couple of the big 4 banks, in fact, and I've seen different things. And just to keep a very high level, one of the banks approached their PMOs governance support functions by eliminating them. Completely. So they found no need for them and made a decision. I'm not sure who made the decision, but they made a decision to remove the function completely. And it wasn't a gradual progression. It was quite a fast-paced move to actually remove that, because there were traditionalists that believed that there was no place for that within the organization. And so that particular organization omitted their PMO governance support functions and went with the view that agile teams should be self-governing. That happened a while ago, and they have now been in a position to review whether that particular approach within a banking organisation for them is the right approach, and are reassessing. Outcomes as a result of doing that has resulted in some confusion, and in my experience, I've seen actually the peripheral organisation departments are the ones that are the most confused. Because if you think about it, the departments on the peripheral, the departments like HR, audit, finance, etc., they are generally not in the delivery space, and they may have SMEs that sit within the delivery space and contribute to projects and testing and whatnot, but they are actually outside of that. And so they are seeing this rapid shift from, the more traditional ways of working to something new, and they are, I don't think that they're being kept up to date. I think they're kind of being left behind in some organizations. And definitely within banking is something that I'm seeing. Another example for banking was an organisation that took a different approach, where they decided to revise completely the function of their PMO governance support. They did that in one part of the bank initially, and I think that was actually a good approach, doing that initially just to test the theory. Agile is all about test and learn, and failing fast. And so they did that within the organization, within a particular department, and actually assessed the challenges that they were having prior to transforming to more agile ways of working, and looked at what they needed to do to actually change their approach from what they were doing before to what they are doing now. And doing it in isolation of the rest of the organization for this particular bank worked really well, because it enabled them to test and learn and actually see whether they did that on a bigger scale, what would happen. Speaking to the previous head of PMO within this department around how his role has changed and where his role has gone from until now, there was a real big shift. His role went from defining what projects had to do to actually flipping that around and saying, what do we, as in the PMO resources, himself included, need to do to make them more successful. And that's a really good way of thinking about it. PMOs are often, in the traditional sense of the word, are there for command and control type functions, but we really need to think about supporting the delivery teams and helping them to be more successful. And we're not going to do that by, hammering them with processes and procedures that maybe don't actually work with what they're doing. We need to actually speak to them. I like to say, seek to understand before you seek to be understood. So within this banking division, they decided to trial out transforming their PMO governance support into a more agile environment. And they took away that there was only a couple of key areas that they really needed to focus on. Was probably three, I'd say. One of them was the financial management. They were really heavily involved in financial management. They were responsible for rolling that information up and making sure that the projects were allocated funds as needed to continue work, and had funds, and the outcomes that were being delivered as a result of those funds were being done, working on the right things in the right way. And the second one was around reporting, not your traditional reporting, not your 40-page PowerPoint deck, which I've seen too many times in organizations that nobody reads. On a point, if you don't read a report that you receive, please tell them so that they can stop creating these reports. So reporting was another one that this, lead was responsible for helping to drive. And that reporting would come in different various forms. Within this area, they use different tools, and sometimes it would be about getting information around the status of a particular team's delivery work by using tools such as Jira, for example. Rather than creating a PowerPoint pack, we went into looking at how we can extract information from that Jira tool. And that was one of the things that they did. So finance and reporting, and then investment management. So one of the large banks at the moment have reframed the way that they do their investment management. Rather than having a traditional EPMO, they've changed that focus completely and called it something else. But at the end of the day, it's still focused on managing the investments, the investment slate, and funding that's coming from the board and CEO directive. And so there were the three key areas that this particular, past traditional PMO focused team went to more of an agile environment focus to support those projects and taking away the headache that related to those three areas. Another example would be financial services. So if we think about financial services, another organization as an example, we took a really different approach to how we would actually go about transforming this organization to more agile ways of working. Some parts of the organization were already, well ahead with the implementation of SAFe, and that was their preferred, agile framework. Whereas a lot of the other parts of the organization were still doing traditional projects with all the traditional, traditional PMO models, etc. So one of the key things around this particular organization was us making sure that we could bring together the two. So there are going to be organizations at times that have agile and traditional running at the same time. And that's okay. It can work. We just have to make sure that we are able to integrate where needed, especially when we are talking about governance, support PMO, and being able to roll up information. So to give you a couple of examples of some of the things we did is we made sure that we worked closely with internal audit teams to help them to have the right information from both the agile delivery functions as well as the traditional delivery functions. Because at the end of the day, audit needs to still do their day-to-day jobs, and there were aspects of internal audit that they needed to undertake. And so they were able to do that with the help of the PMO function. Secondly, financial management. So the agile teams that were rolling out SAFe did a little bit different to how the traditional finance is done within projects. And that is they probably spent a lot less time on it, I would say. I mean, they had a view on how many resources they need and what they were going to be delivering. But other than that, they didn't spend too much time on the finance space. Whereas the traditional projects and program managers there, they spent a lot more time on their finances, looking at resources, both resources being people, but also resources as in hardware, software, etc. So there was two completely different approaches. So what we needed to do within the enterprise PMO function was actually bring those together. And we did that in a way that enabled us to actually integrate different ways of working, because we had to respect the past with the traditional project managers, the way that they were doing things and the way that they were tasked with doing things and wanting to do things, but also looking at the way that the agile teams were working. And so we had to integrate the two. Another key thing that we did was actually looking at how we did reporting, and the reporting piece as well was a really interesting one, because the traditional reporting method that was happening was, again, the bane of my existence, but really cumbersome large PowerPoint decks, and they were just pages upon pages, and I mean, I don't even think that half of it was being read. Actually, it wasn't, because we tested to see what would happen if we chopped out some of the pages, and nobody complained. It's a really good technique to do when you're looking at whether or not you need to keep a certain report in. So with reporting, it was really important for us to actually extract information from delivery teams, both traditional and the agile space as well. And the way that we did that was by working with those teams to understand how they were tracking certain information, such as risks and issues, or resource load, etc., and putting it in a way that we could actually access that data from specific functions they were running. For example, in Jira, there is things like risk and issues, for example. We extracted those from there and didn't make the project managers retype it into a PowerPoint pack. Whereas the traditional project managers didn't use Jira, and so they were using Excel spreadsheets. So we just centralized all of their risks and issues spreadsheets into a centralized list on SharePoint. And therefore, we had all the information we needed to access in order for us to do reporting. If we move into telco, another example in the telco space was actually a conversation I was having recently, and one of the things they did, which was actually really interesting, is they were rolling out SAFe in their organization, for the true sense of the word, and they had a PMO team and they had a support team, and they were both doing different things. The PMO teams themselves focused on sort of your day-to-day management. They helped with, purchase orders and, onboarding of resources, etc. Whereas the support teams actually worked and were embedded within the delivery functions themselves. And one of the interesting things I learned recently is around how this organization went from what they had before, which was a quite a complex environment, to actually turning the environment around and making it a culture of trust. Trust was the biggest single most improvement that they were able to flush out and integrate heavily into their organization. That resulted them in having a lot more success in a shorter space of time. So how are you building trust in your organization? We need to remember that people have come from different backgrounds and have different experiences, and some people may not like the move towards more agile ways of working. So we need to respect that, but also work out what's the best for the organization as a whole. Then we look at government organizations. So I've been doing some work with government in the last 2.5 years, 3 years, and some of the work being done in that space is actually very different. I mean, there is a lot of talk about these government agencies wanting to be agile and go to agile ways of working, but they're actually not really doing it. I mean, I'm sure there's a few, and I know that there has been a few that have really sunk their teeth into it. But otherwise, government is really, spends a lot of time implementing and have had, Prince 2 and P3, M3 type models in their organizations previously. And so their shift to more agile ways of working is a completely different one altogether, where what I've seen in some government organizations, what they've been doing is actually focusing on what aspects of their existing functions within an organization can be reduced to save cost, and then basically taking that work and giving it to the project delivery community. And I've seen that cause some, it's caused some challenges, I would say, because the project delivery teams are, now being given all this excessive governance, support, admin work that, would have otherwise been taken care of by a PMO function or a support function, whatever you want to call it. And so they've actually gone a little bit backwards by putting that all on the project management community. They're effectively limiting the amount of delivery that a project management team can focus on because they are so bogged down in process. And so I've actually seen some of these project managers who have been significantly impacted as a result of these big, organizational changes, with resources being removed, and therefore the linkages that they project delivery function used to have with things like with teams like internal finance and accounting and HR, etc., are now, there's no longer a third party supporting that link between the two. Effectively, the project management team have to go direct. That just adds a lot of work onto their existing workload, and I have seen firsthand has resulted in them being able to deliver less. I'll give you an example within the banking space. I recently, well, not too recently, but in the last 2 years, I was doing some work within the banking space, and within a particular department, they were running a workforce management model that was using Excel, and the Excel functionality, although the tool was quite neat, it was something that seemed quite clever. It actually was just not, process-wise, was not set up in the right way. And what I mean by that is there were so many different leads trying to access the same information, and it was actually causing them to rework other people's information because there was double data entry, duplication. It was hard to track historical information. And so we actually had to look at how do we change this approach and make it work for, the whole department. And so we had to look at what they were using the data for, how often they had to track that data. We actually found, interestingly, that as a result of this lackluster process that existed around their workforce management tool, that they were spending, I'd say, based on the conversations, at least 8 hours a week tracking their resources. 8 hours a week of, a team lead's role spent on admin. Admin for one part of their role. Now, admin is not a bad thing. Admin is really important. Everybody needs to do some. But actually spending 8 hours on something that what we later realized is by modifying the processes surrounding the tool was able to reduce that by 80-90% was a really good result. So in government, with so many changes and so many consultants coming in and out, and so many, changes in how things are run and policies and whatnot, some organizations are making changes quite fast, but not actually maybe assessing the changes and the long-term outcome of those. And that was certainly my experience with one of the government organizations around maybe omitting things such as the governance, support, coordinators, analysts, etc., and realizing later that maybe actually we needed those. And then a final example just around retail. So I've worked in retail before and have spent some time with some retail organizations in recent times as well. And retail in itself run projects very differently to a lot of the other industries that I've worked in. I would say that in retail, obviously their customers are different. They trying to appeal to their customers with their brands and products and things like that. I mean, the way that retail is moving to more agile is, I think it's being led by the IT departments. And so what's happening there is, in some organizations, the IT delivery teams are going, hey, let's do things in a more agile way. And they are following, methods and aspects of the frameworks, the Agile Manifesto, or following a particular methodology like SAFe, for example. And what's happening is they're leading the way in that, but the business teams are actually getting a little bit left behind. They do not get access to the same information. There is no, there wasn't any integration between the two. And so they're kind of working with best intentions in isolation of one another. And so there is some challenges there about how much of the old things that we used to do, the traditional things that we used to do, need to change to be able to keep up with IT and the way that IT were running their organization. So within the last few years, as I mentioned, my team and I, we've got a team of 8. My team and I have worked with a number of those organizations and many more beyond that as well. And what we've been able to do is we're using our AMO method, which is effectively an approach for the governance support. Actually, if I really break it down, it's an approach for facilitation, enablement, and integration. And that is, in a nutshell, the three areas that we focus on as part of, implementation. With organizations, we focus on the facilitation, the enablement, and the integration parts. And that's what our AMO method enables us to do. And we've been able to do that quite successfully, in particular through some of our customers where we've been able to test and learn along the way and actually experience firsthand their feedback in regards to how we've gone to approach things. The AMO method is something that we are really, really proud of, something that we are, continuously evolving and actually helping to drive, a greater uplift in the PMO governance support space, because for far too long they have had to follow, the project management delivery methods as opposed to having their own. And so using the method, I and the team work together closely to develop enterprise-wide approaches for organizations that enable better facilitation, integration, and enablement. And I just wanted to share some of the key learnings in this podcast today. First of all, organizations are unsure where to start or how to start. So one of the things to think about is what your end goal is and work backwards, and think about what parts of what you're doing today are actually, working, and look at how you can leave them in place or just uplift them slightly. Organizations are unsure the role that PMO and governance has in Agile. As I said, traditionalists believe that there is no such thing as PMO in Agile, and that's okay. There isn't a mention of PMO in the manifesto as far as I'm aware, but there is still a place for it, because too many instances where they've been removed and omitted, as I mentioned earlier, is actually resulting in more work later. And I've actually seen and heard some organizations that are actually reverting back to the more traditional concept of governance, because they are unable to rely on just having a particular, function. At the end of the day, delivery functions are there to deliver and governance functions are there to govern. And so they're both going to be more specialists in that space. And so there is a need for both. People across organizations working with best intentions, but working in isolation of one another. Enterprise agility is about enterprise-wide approach to delivery, governance, etc. We should all be working to the same strategy. We should all be working with the same end goals in mind. And unfortunately, despite best intentions, people are working in isolation of one another. And that may be just because they are, trying to figure things out as they go. But working together collaboratively means you're going to get a much higher output. So I implore you to engage more parts of the organization. Integrating a governance/PMO function with Agile does not mean throw everything out and start again. There are too many examples where that has happened, and it's actually such a waste of time and such a waste of effort. There's some really strong, good parts of the traditional PMO methods that should be considered in lieu of this change of moving to Agile. Just because you're moving to Agile, it does not mean throw everything good that is working out the door and start again. Applying aspects of Agile and Lean would be my recommendation, as opposed to trying to drive every part of it. Don't go and try to follow any particular parts of the framework and say, I'm going to follow this to a T every single step of it. Because every organization is different. Every delivery environment is different. Every culture in an organization is different. And so it's important to look at what aspects you would integrate as opposed to trying to drive every part of it. Assess your current situation before you make any major moves. Now, I'm talking about major moves where, you're shutting down delivery functions, or you're going out and purchasing really expensive tools, or you're eliminating, particular processes that, integrate with other parts of the organization that may be working fine. You do that, you're going to pay a lot of people off. So think about the situation that you've got and assess that before you make any major moves. We, within Agile Management Office, actually spend a little bit of time undertaking an immersion phase within organizations to actually help them assess their readiness, but also around what areas that we think they should target first based on our observations, interviews that we undertake, and feedback we get from their stakeholders. And that's a really important part of what we do to enable us to help them make the right moves going forward. And then assessing the culture and mindset of your organization. Can your organization be agile, not just do agile? Agile is a lot about mindset. It's a lot about culture. As I mentioned earlier, one organization went from having, maybe not as strong in terms of trust, but going and doing everything they can to turn that around and built an organization, and their department, in fact, was built on such a strong trust within one another. There was no more fear. There was more trust, and working together collaboratively, they were able to deliver amazing things. And so their mindset in their organization maybe did not start like that, but they were able to be agile and do things to build trust again within their departments and their teams to actually enable them to do agile. And so you need to assess the culture and mindset of your organization, and just make sure, check if it's ready. I mean, it's a big change moving to or transforming to an agile environment. So maybe you're not ready, maybe you are, who knows? So there's some of the key learnings that I've shared. If you would like to know anything further, please get in touch with me. You can find myself on LinkedIn. I can be found under my name, so Fatima, Fatimah. Surname is Abbouchi. I just wanted to say thank you for listening to this podcast. I welcome any feedback. If you'd like us to cover any specific topics in future, or you want to be part of our podcast in future sessions, or you want to sponsor a future podcast, please let us know by going to www.agilemanagementoffice.com. And if you subscribe to our newsletter on our website, you will have access to a lot more tips, tools, and some of our best information and knowledge there that we're getting from working with clients in the trenches on a day-to-day. I hope you've been able to learn, feel, think, or be inspired today. Until next time, what's your #Agile idea?